If you've played EA Sports UFC for a considerable amount of time, hell, if you've played any competitive game at all, you've probably heard the word meta. But what the heck does it actually mean? Well, meta is an acronym for most effective tactics available. In simple terms, it's the strategy that gives you the best chance to win. Every competitive game has a meta. There's always that one dominant playstyle, those go-to moves, those strategies that just works better than everything else. And that's fine, every game needs a meta. But here's the thing, in a game like EA Sports UFC 5, should the meta be universal? Should you be able to pick almost any fighter and play them the exact same way? Now, I personally don't think so. In real MMA, no two fighters fight exactly alike. So why does it feel like you can approach most matchups the same way in the game? That's what I want to talk about today. And I think a really good way to fix this issue is through fighter uniqueness and also player restrictions. Now, before I expand on these solutions, let's make sure we understand what I mean when I say that UFC 5 has a universal meta. And I'll do this by talking about one of the most dominant metas in the game, the slip meta. If you've played UFC online, you've 100% seen it. You've probably even used it. It's a system of striking where you bait your opponent into throwing something predictable just so you can slip out of the way and land a hard counter. One of the most popular sequences looks like this. Player A throws a punch to the body, then instantly slips their head to the side, expecting player B to fire back with an uppercut. If player B throws the uppercut, player A is already out of the way and cracks player B with a big counter, usually a hook. I'll give you a second version of this. Someone throws a strike at you, you evade it by pulling your head back, and instead of countering to their head, you throw an uppercut to the body because you anticipate they are going to try to pull on their own, which of course leads to you doing a lot of damage to their body because they are leaned back when you fire it off the uppercut to the body. And of course, there's the classic forward moving slip hook, the bread and butter of high level UFC 5 gameplay. Everyone does this shit while using every single fighter. It's arguably the most common offensive tool in the game's current meta. Now, I'm not saying the slip meta is bad on its own. Head movement and counters are a huge part of MMA, so that's fine. The problem is that this strategy can work for every single fighter. It doesn't matter if you're using a slick counter striker like Israel Adesanya or a pressure heavy brawler like Paulo Costa. Almost everyone can execute these same sequences with the same level of effectiveness. And that is exactly what I think UFC 6 needs to change. Now, before we continue, there's an important debate that we need to address. Should fighters in EA Sports UFC be entities of their own, where players have to learn how to use them properly to win? Or should they be more like vessels for player creativity, where anyone can be played however the player wants? Does that make sense? So should you 100% have to use Conor McGregor exactly how Conor fights in real life if you want to win? Or should Conor McGregor just be a vessel for your own creativity where you pick Conor and just use him however you want? Now, personally, I lean towards the first approach. Fighters should have clear identities, and the best way to succeed with them should be to fight like they fight in real life. The best Conor McGregor player in the game should be the one who uses Conor's real life style effectively, not the one who turns him into a high pressure volume striker like Nick Diaz or whatever. On the other hand, players shouldn't be able to take someone like Paulo Costa and turn him into a technical counter striker like Adesanya. MMA fighters are unique in their own way, and the game should not just reflect that, it should 100% fucking enforce it. Right now, UFC 5 allows players to impose their own styles on any fighter, and that's not the way it should work. UFC 6 should do the opposite. Force players to specialize in fighters that match their style instead of bending fighters to fit them. Find a fighter that resonates with you as opposed to making fighters resonate with you. Does that make sense? Now, one of the best examples of a game that forces individuality in its characters is Marvel Rivals. Unlike EA Sports UFC 5, where fighters can feel interchangeable because they share too many mechanics, Marvel Rivals is designed in a way that makes sure that every single hero plays according to their unique strengths and weaknesses. The game achieves this by dividing characters into 3 distinct archetypes. You have the Vanguards, the Duelists, and the Strategists. The Vanguards they're basically tanks, right? The frontline brawlers, the bruisers, who are built to absorb damage and control the battlefield. They're essential for creating space, taking pressure off their teammates. An example of this will be the Incredible Hulk, who uses brute force and strength and durability to dominate those close quarter combat. Then you have the duelists. These are the characters designed to do high damage, but they're also high skill, relying on speed, precision, and outmaneuvering the opponents. They're deadly when played well, but they're also kind of fragile and require smart decision making. An example will be someone like Spider-Man, who utilizes his agility and web-based attacks to stay mobile and pick off opponents. And lastly, you have the strategists. These are tactical, support-oriented characters who manipulate the battlefield with deception, buffs, or debuffs. They're not designed for direct combat and must be played intelligently. An example of this is Loki, who uses illusions and misdirections rather than brute force. In Marvel Rivals, you can't play Loki like Spider-Man. Loki isn't built to swing into fights and trade blows like a duelist, and Spider-Man himself isn't designed to sit back and manipulate the battlefield like a strategist. The game forces players to engage with characters' unique playstyles, not the playstyle they personally prefer. But hell, it goes even deeper than that. As I was doing my research, I realized that even within the same archetypes, characters in Marvel Rivals have distinct playstyles that demand different approaches. Example, take Spider-Man and Black Panther. Both of them are classified as duelists, yet they couldn't be more different in how they should be played. Spider-Man uses speed, web-based attacks, evasive movements to hit opponents, and then quickly disengage. He thrives on mobility, precision, and controlling angles. Black Panther, on the other hand, plays a more grounded, aggressive game with fast melee combos, pounce attacks, and counter-striking abilities. He doesn't rely on distance as much as Spider-Man, but instead uses explosive speed and raw power to overwhelm his opponents. If you try to play Black Panther like Spider-Man, staying at range, constantly evading, you just waste his strengths. And if you try to fight with Spider-Man like Black Panther, standing in the pocket and exchanging blows, you'll quickly realize he's not built for that shit. This level of distinction is exactly what UFC 6 needs. Even within categories like strikers, wrestlers, or kickboxers, no two fighters should feel the same. Each fighter should have a distinct flow, unique mechanics, and built-in advantages that forces players to adapt to their real-life strengths and weaknesses. That way, picking a fighter becomes more than just picking stats. It becomes about mastering a specific playstyle. So, with all this said, how does this apply to UFC 6? Well, right now in UFC 5, as I already mentioned, you can take a fighter like Stephen Thompson, a karate-based striker, and fight in the pocket like a pressure brawler without any major disadvantages. You can take someone like Paulo Costa, a forward-moving pressure fighter, and turn him into a patient counter-striker. There's nothing stopping you from overriding a fighter's natural strengths and making them fit your own personal style. Marvel Rivals, like I already mentioned, make sure that every single character feels unique and must be played correctly to maximize effectiveness. And UFC 6 should do the same. Period. Fighters should have distinct styles, built-in advantages, and limitations. Don't forget that, limitations that force players to adapt rather than letting them use every single fighter the same way. To achieve this, UFC 6 should incorporate more fighter-specific mechanics. Fighter-specific mechanics. Not overall mechanics. Fighter-specific. That makes it impossible to ignore a fighter's real-life strengths. If a fighter is an elite kicker, for example, they should have access to things like, maybe better kicking recoveries, less punishment for missing kicks, more fluid movements when setting them up. If a fighter is an elite boxer, well, their punches should be sharper, tighter, and harder to counter in the pocket. If a fighter is a bad wrestler, well, shooting for takedowns should feel really slow and awkward. You get the point. Like, you shouldn't want to use someone who has bad takedowns to shoot. You should feel from the animation, man, this guy was not designed to shoot takedowns. Fighter identity needs to be the foundation of the meta. The goal should be about making the game look more realistic, but also make sure playing against different fighters feels different. If you're fighting a specialist, you should immediately feel the difference in their movement, striking mechanics, and defensive abilities. Facing a world-class kicker like Edson Barboza should make you rethink how you approach the fight, just as facing an elite grappler like Khabib should make you respect the takedown game far more than you would against someone like Sean O'Malley. Marvel Rivals has already proven that a game can enforce character individuality without ruining balance, and it's time for UFC 6 to take the same approach. Make fighter identities non-negotiable. Force it on players, instead of allowing players to override them with a universal playstyle. Alright, so I've laid out the issue, I've given you guys some examples, and I've briefly touched on solutions, but how do we actually fix this issue? How do we make it so that every fighter in UFC 6, at least a lot of fighters, or majority of fighters in UFC 6, have a clear identity and force players to engage with their real strengths and weaknesses? The answer to me is really fucking simple. Two things: restrictions and animations. Let's talk about restrictions first. A big reason why fighters in UFC 5 feel so similar is because they all have access to almost the same fundamental tools. Every fighter can throw all basic punches, all basic kicks, and every fighter can switch stances, even if they've never done it in real life. UFC Undisputed 3, for example, did not work like this, and that's one of the reasons why that game feels more authentic even to this day. In Undisputed 3, for example, if a fighter did not throw body uppercuts in real life, they simply did not have access to them in the game. If a fighter wasn't known for switching stances, they couldn't do it in the game. You literally couldn't switch stances in the game if you did not switch in real life. It didn't matter how controversial that was. If you wanted to fight in Southpaw in Undisputed 3, well, tough luck. You had to pick a fighter who actually fought in Southpaw. If you want to be able to switch your stance freely in a fight in Undisputed 3, you had to pick a fighter who is known for stance switching. It forced players to respect fighters' actual skill sets rather than bending them to fit their own preferences. If THQ, for example, made another game right now, I guarantee you won't be able to just pick Conor McGregor and then go orthodox just because you feel more comfortable fighting orthodox, but you also really enjoy the benefits of using Conor. Nah, you would have to fight with Conor in Southpaw even if you're not comfortable with it, or pick somebody else, boy. Pick somebody else. This level of restriction created true fighter individuality, and UFC 6 should absolutely bring this back, in my opinion. Let's look at a real life example: calf kicks. In UFC 5, every single fighter in the game can throw calf kicks, even though not every fighter in MMA actually uses them. Someone like Israel Adesanya, despite being an elite kicker, doesn't really throw calf kicks, but Alex Pereira does. In UFC 6, this distinction should be evident. It should matter. Alex should have clear advantages when it comes to leg kicking exchanges against Izzy, not just because of stat differences. Oh, the stat says that if you kick with Alex Pereira, you do more damage. No, but because he has access to techniques that Israel simply doesn't. The calf kick is harder to read. It does not have the same windup as a regular leg kick. And so because of that, it is easier to land more consistently. It's easier to hide. And that in of itself will give you an inherent advantage when kicking the legs. Alex should have that advantage. Israel should not. This philosophy should also be applied across the board. Fighters who don't kick often should not have fluid, clean kicking animations. Fighters who aren't wrestlers should have slower, more telegraphed takedowns that feel awkward to execute. Fighters who are high volume punchers should throw punches smoother and recover faster between strikes. These small restrictions would go a long way in making fighters feel different. It would force players to learn their fighters' real-life skill set rather than just imposing their own playstyle on every single fighter they pick. Now, restrictions are a great start, but what would really push fighter uniqueness to the next level is animations. I've been begging and screaming about animations for as long as I can fucking remember. Oh my god. Right now in UFC 5, the biggest reason why so many fighters feel the same is because they all share the same animations, man. Whether you're using an elite boxer, a volume puncher, or a pressure brawler, a lot of the punches look and feel identical. The same applies to kicks, takedowns, and overall movement. Animations should be the single biggest distinction between a fighter who is really good at something and a fighter who is sort of good at it. Let's use Conor and Dustin Poirier for example. Both of these guys could be classified as pressure style strikers with a preference to boxing. But if you look at the way they pressure, you'll notice that Conor most so pressures opponents with his footwork, making the octagon feel very small and claustrophobic, which then forces them to either shell up or lash out at him. If you shell up, he picks you apart. And if you lash out at him, he uses head movement to evade your strikes and counter you. He's exceptional at slips, pull, and duck counters, and also exceptional at intercepting counters. But because he tends to keep his head on the center line when he throws, he occasionally gets hit during combination exchanges in the pocket. Dustin Poirier, on the other hand, is more of a combination style pressure fighter. He is more gritty, more battle tested, a better inside boxer, and just overall more of a dog. He does a better job than Conor at keeping his head off the center line during long combinations, which allows him to land where his opponents miss. Because of this distinction, in a Conor versus Dustin Poirier matchup, the McGregor player should want to be more of a sniper and avoid exchanging long combinations with Dustin. Meanwhile, the Dustin Poirier player should want to make the fight more gritty and have more combination battles. For Conor, his punches should be more accurate, especially when throwing straight punches. His counters of head movement should be blindingly fast and extremely powerful. And when he's intercepting with single shots, his shots should be more accurate. For Dustin Poirier, his combinations should be shorter, crisper, and more compact than other fighters. Some of his strikes, especially when thrown in combination, should come with built-in evasion, essentially shifting his head off the center line, making it naturally easier for him to win exchanges. Some other advantages that elite boxers could have, for example, is less slow down when a punch is blocked. So for example, someone like Ilia Topuria should be able to flow through blocked punches more easily, while a less skilled boxer will feel more sluggish when their strikes are blocked. You could give them faster recovery after a whiff so that missing a punch is less punishing for them compared to someone with sloppier boxing mechanics who, when they whiff, they fall over themselves, they lose their balance and all that. This same principle should also apply to elite kickers. Someone like Edson Barboza should have kicking animations that allow him to partially block while kicking, right? Like right now, if you throw a kick in UFC 5, you're completely open to counters. Elite kickers should be able to keep their guard up mid-kick, making them harder to punish. For some of them, for example, perhaps the kick animation won't have a full 360 spin after a missed kick, so that when you miss, you're not left completely exposed to getting countered. You could reduce the slowdown that happens when a kick is blocked, so that if someone blocks a head kick from Barboza, for example, he should be able to recover faster than someone who isn't as skilled at kicking. The animation should also be much cleaner, textbook perfect animations, and for some kickers, for example, their kick should have no wind-up, which will make them easier to sneak in. A good example is the lead leg roundhouse to the body right now in UFC 5. There's a version of that kick assigned to someone like Topuria where there's no wind-up and the kick is fast. It has become a fan favorite because of this. We need more strikes like this. Every strike from an elite kicker should look effortless, while fighters who don't rely on kicks should have a bit more wind-up and recovery in their motions. And what about grappling? This is where UFC 5 really drops the ball. Every fighter, no matter their skill set, shares the same basic takedown animations. Khabib's takedowns should not look anything like Edson Barboza's takedowns. In UFC Undisputed 3, for example, different fighters had different takedown animations depending on their grappling background. GSP had an explosive, picture-perfect double leg. Brock Lesnar had a brute force style takedown. Jiu-Jitsu fighters had more upper body focused takedowns attempts similar to the style that Donald Cerrone uses. UFC 6 should absolutely revamp grappling animation so that wrestlers and elite grapplers feel dominant and strikers feel out of their element when attempting those takedowns. Now, the end goal should be making fighter uniqueness matter. That is the entire point. The entire point is to make it go beyond stats and perks and attributes. If you pick Ilia Topuria, his boxing should feel naturally sharper, cleaner, and more fluid than anyone else in the division. If you pick Edson Barboza, his kicks should feel smoother, faster, and more punishing than anyone else with average kicks. And if you pick Khabib, his takedowns should be fast, explosive, almost no telegraph to the level change, and it should cover more distance, while a lower level wrestler should feel like they have to struggle to complete the shot. Right now in UFC 5, man, fighter stats are really the only thing separating fighters. But stats don't mean much if the gameplay itself doesn't reflect those differences, the animations. Fighters should feel different in how they move, how they strike, and how they grapple. If UFC 6 gets this right, it would be the most immersive MMA experience ever created. But if they don't, we're just going to get another game where every fighter feels like a reskinned version of the next. I don't want that shit, and I'm sure you guys don't either. Whew, that's been a long one. All right, so to close this thing out, I think gone should be the days where players impose their own styles on fighters. You know, I think fighters should have their own meta based on how they fight in real life. And the best players, the guys at number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5, the guys in the top 10 should be players who learn their fighter styles and master it. That's my hope for UFC 6. That the players at the top 10 will be sim-style players. Can you imagine how awesome that would be? Fuck, I hope they do that. Anyways, what do you guys think? Do you agree that UFC 6 should enforce fighter individuality more than previous games? Let me know in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. Thank you so much for watching, boys. I'll see you boys later. Peace out. Have a good one.